A shop owner kicked out a British old lady from the shop, and what happened later will shock you. So watch till the end. The small shop sat nestled between two bustling cafes, its wooden sign swaying gently in the wind. On the outside, it looked like any other local business, but the interior was something special. Antique clocks ticked softly on one wall, their hands frozen in time, while delicate porcelain figurines lined the shelves, their painted faces still as the moment they were crafted. Ethan, the young shop owner, stood behind the counter, adjusting items with a meticulous precision that bordered on obsession. The shop was a reflection of his ambition, a business he had inherited from his grandfather, and Ethan had big plans for it. Despite his youthful dreams, the shop had never quite taken off. It was not that Ethan lacked drive or effort, it was more that he didn't fully understand the heart of running a successful business. Customers came and went, but the shop's charm seemed to go unnoticed by the young man, who was too focused on profits to appreciate the true magic of the antique world. He would often take shortcuts to make the shop more modern, abandoning the original charm in pursuit of quick sales. This was Ethan's shop, but little did he know, it was about to be forever changed by a quiet visitor. Ethan spent most of his days alone in the shop, carefully cleaning the displays and arranging items in what he thought was the most marketable way. His actions were precise and quick, driven by the pressure of making his business profitable. His grandfather, who had run the shop for decades, always spoke of the value of patience and respect for the customers, but Ethan was too focused on the bottom line. He believed that the key to success was speed and efficiency, and he often found himself rushing through interactions with people in the hopes of making a quick sale. But as Ethan rushed about, adjusting a shelf or dusting a display case, he failed to notice the small details that made his shop special: the antique mirrors with cracks in their glass, the weathered wooden table that told the story of generations. The shop's charm was in the imperfections, in the personal touch that Ethan's grandfather had always given it. But now, Ethan was on a mission to make it into something bigger and more polished, something that appealed to modern sensibilities. He believed that if he made the shop look more like a high-end boutique, it would attract wealthier clientele and make him more money. He was about to discover that the true value of the shop was something far more intangible. The bell above the door chimed softly as Mrs. Walker entered the shop. She was a petite woman, her hair silvered with age but still carefully combed, and her floral coat was a testament to a time when fashion was more about grace than trends. The air inside the shop seemed to change with her presence. Her cane clicked lightly on the floor as she moved slowly through the aisles, taking in the items with the quiet reverence of someone who had lived through much and appreciated beauty in all its forms. Her soft British accent echoed as she greeted Ethan, who barely looked up from his work. Ethan, caught up in the endless cycle of business, gave her a distracted nod. He didn't even register the woman's presence at first, so consumed was he with his thoughts of profit. He was used to seeing older customers wander in, take a quick look, and then leave without buying anything. This time, however, there was something different about Mrs. Walker. Her eyes moved over the items with a kind of recognition, as though she understood their history, their value. But Ethan, in his hurry to check off the day's tasks, failed to see this and, instead, gave her little attention. Mrs. Walker, aware of his disinterest, remained quiet, knowing that she would have to work a little harder to be heard. Mrs. Walker took a step closer to Ethan, clearing her throat to politely grab his attention. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice soft yet firm. Ethan, caught up in his task, didn't immediately acknowledge her. When he finally did, it was with a half-hearted glance over his shoulder. Mrs. Walker, accustomed to being treated with respect, raised an eyebrow but remained patient. "I was hoping you could tell me more about that particular piece," she said, pointing to an antique clock on the shelf. "It's quite beautiful." Ethan's response was quick and curt. "It's a grandfather clock. Very old, not much to say about it, really. If you're interested, it's £200. He turned back to his task, not waiting for her response. Mrs. Walker, slightly taken aback by the abruptness of his reply, gave him a small smile. She could tell that Ethan's focus was entirely on the sale, rather than the art or history behind the items. But she decided not to press the matter. Instead, she simply nodded and began to walk slowly through the shop, her thoughts turning over in her mind. She wasn't one to make a fuss, but something about this encounter felt off. Noticing Ethan's dismissive attitude, Mrs. Walker remained unfazed. She had seen the world change many times over and knew how to navigate situations like this. "I won't take up much of your time," she said, her tone warm yet resolute. "I simply wish to look around for a moment longer." Ethan, his mind still on other matters, gave her a brief nod, not realizing that her presence was far more significant than he had assumed. He continued to tidy up around the counter, his movements quick and impatient. Mrs. Walker continued to walk around the shop, her eyes taking in the details Ethan had missed, the small chips in the furniture, the dust that lingered on the shelves, and the absence of any real personal touch in the displays. She could sense that Ethan was trying too hard to make the shop something it wasn't, focusing too much on exterior appearances. She paused by a set of antique silverware, her fingers grazing the delicate patterns, and thought about the true value of these items, value that Ethan had yet to grasp. She wasn't in a rush, she was simply taking her time, considering what had brought her here. But little did she know, her presence in the shop was already setting into motion something much larger than a simple purchase. As Mrs. Walker moved slowly through the shop, taking her time to examine each piece, Ethan's patience began to wear thin. The ticking of the clocks around him grew louder in his ears, reminding him of the hours that were slipping by. He had a list of things to do, and the woman was taking up precious time that could be spent on more urgent tasks. The shop's floor had only a few customers per day, and he needed to make the most of every interaction. "She's just browsing," he muttered under his breath, his irritation bubbling to the surface. Ethan's gaze kept flicking over to Mrs. Walker, watching her as she took yet another slow step towards the back of the shop. If she's not going to buy anything, she might as well leave, he thought, his impatience growing with every second. He had bigger dreams for the shop, plans to turn it into something grander, and this slow-paced customer was in his way. The thoughts gnawed at him as he tried to focus on rearranging the display case. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the more he rushed, the more his efforts were falling short. Mrs. Walker had no idea how much her presence was beginning to irritate him, but she continued to browse, quietly and purposefully. Mrs. Walker continued to explore the shop with a deliberate calmness. She wasn't concerned with the time, nor with Ethan's apparent annoyance. The items in the shop, each holding a story, captivated her. She found herself drawn to a collection of porcelain figurines, their faces serene but slightly faded with age. She gently picked up one of the figures, admiring the intricate details. "These are quite exquisite," she remarked, her voice soft yet carrying the weight of years of experience in fine antiques. Ethan, who had been busy restocking the counter, half turned toward her and gave a dismissive grunt. Despite his attitude, Mrs. Walker pressed on, asking him a few questions about the figurines. "Are they from the Victorian era?" she inquired, her fingers lightly tracing the figure's painted dress. Ethan barely looked up. "They're just some old pieces." "Not worth much," he said, his tone flat. Mrs. Walker paused, sensing that Ethan was missing the point entirely. She knew these were no ordinary figurines, though Ethan couldn't see the value in them. She was beginning to realize that the shop was more than just a business. It was a reflection of the owner's character, and there was much more at stake here than she initially thought. Frustration surged through Ethan as Mrs. Walker continued her leisurely exploration of the shop. His patience, already thin, snapped. He was tired of the endless cycle of polite customers who came in, took a look, and never returned. He was trying to run a business, after all. With an exasperated sigh, he walked over to where Mrs. Walker stood examining the porcelain figurines. "Look," he said sharply, "I don't have all day. Either buy something or leave. I've got a lot to do." His words were harsh, his tone lacking the civility he had once learned from his grandfather. Mrs. Walker froze, her eyes lifting slowly to meet his. The shop had once been a sanctuary, a place of peace and reflection, but in Ethan's hands, it had become just another hustle. The air between them was thick with tension. Mrs. Walker, her face a mask of calm, slowly placed the figurine back on the shelf. "You are rushing too much, young man," she said quietly. "It's the rush that's costing you, not the time." Ethan, taken aback by her calm response, opened his mouth to retort but stopped himself. Something about her words lingered, though he wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. Mrs. Walker gave him a gentle smile before walking toward the door. "Take your time," she said softly, "and you might find that time takes care of you." Ethan stood still, watching as the door closed behind her, feeling something shift within him. As Mrs. Walker stepped out of the shop, the bell above the door chimed softly again. Ethan remained standing by the counter, staring at the spot where she had been only moments before. The shop suddenly felt quieter, emptier, as if the energy had shifted with her departure. He glanced at the porcelain figurines she had been admiring, then at the other items in the shop, and a question began to form in his mind. What am I missing here? He had been so focused on getting customers in and out, on pushing products, that he had forgotten why his grandfather had opened the shop in the first place. It wasn't just about sales. It was about connection, about appreciating the stories hidden within the objects. Ethan shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought, but it lingered. He returned to his work, but every task seemed meaningless now. The shop, which had once felt like his future, now seemed like something he didn't fully understand. It was clear that he had been too eager to make it into something it wasn't, and the real lessons, the ones that Mrs. Walker had tried to impart, were just starting to sink in. He felt a pang of regret as he thought about her departure. She had seen something in the shop that he hadn't, and though she hadn't bought anything, she had left him with the most valuable lesson of all. That night, after the shop had closed, Ethan sat at the counter, staring out the window at the empty street. The sound of the ticking clocks around him seemed louder now, almost oppressive. He thought back to the way Mrs. Walker had moved through the shop, how she had taken her time, not rushing, not demanding anything. Her presence had been calm, focused, and it had felt different from the usual frantic energy he tried to impose. The next day, Ethan decided to take a different approach. He'd no longer rush through customer interactions. Instead, he would listen more, ask questions, and focus on what made the items special rather than on their price tags. The next morning, as the sun rose and the shop opened its doors, Ethan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. He spent the day chatting with customers, telling them about the history behind the pieces on the shelves. He didn't sell as much as he used to, but something about it felt right. Over the next few weeks, Ethan noticed a subtle change. The shop became busier, but not because he was pushing for sales. Customers came in because they felt a connection to the items, to the stories behind them. Ethan had learned the true value of patience and respect, and as he grew more attuned to these values, the shop began to thrive in ways he never expected. Months passed, and the shop slowly transformed. Ethan's approach had shifted completely, no longer driven by the frantic need to make quick sales. He had learned that true success couldn't be measured in immediate transactions. Instead, it was about building relationships, creating a space where people felt comfortable enough to pause and reflect. His customers weren't just visitors, they were individuals with their own stories, many of them longing for connection or nostalgia. Ethan had stopped rushing. He no longer watched the clock, counting the hours until closing. Now, he welcomed the conversations that flowed naturally, even if they didn't lead to a sale. There was an old man who came in every week just to sit by the window and watch the traffic pass. He never bought anything, but he had become one of Ethan's most cherished regulars. One afternoon, the old man turned to Ethan and said, "This shop has a way of making time stand still, doesn't it?" Ethan smiled. "It does, doesn't it?" One rainy afternoon, just as Ethan was starting to wind down for the day, a young woman walked into the shop. She was carrying a large, worn leather bag, her eyes scanning the shelves with curiosity. Ethan greeted her with his usual calm, but as she walked toward the counter, her expression became more serious. She placed the bag on the counter and unzipped it slowly. Inside was a delicate, old painting, the colors faded but still striking. "I found this in my grandmother's attic," she explained. "I don't know much about it, but I thought it might belong here." Ethan studied the painting, noticing the brushstrokes and the old frame. It was clear that it had value, but not just in the monetary sense. It was a piece of someone's history, a link to the past. He was about to offer her a price when something held him back. He remembered the lessons he'd learned, the importance of connection, of appreciating the story behind each item. Instead of offering her money, Ethan asked, Tell me about your grandmother. How did she come to own this painting? The young woman hesitated, then began to share the story of her grandmother's travels and the people she had met along the way. By the end of the conversation, Ethan didn't just have a beautiful painting in his shop. He had a new connection, a link to the past that held more than just material value. The woman left without selling the painting, but she promised to return. Ethan smiled as she walked out. The shop wasn't just about antiques anymore. It had become a place of stories, where history lived in the hearts of those who shared it. That night, as Ethan closed up the shop, he sat in the quiet room and reflected on the journey he had been on. The space that had once felt oppressive and full of expectations now felt like a place of comfort. It had taken time, but he had rediscovered the spirit of the shop his grandfather had envisioned. Ethan hadn't just inherited the shop, he had inherited a way of seeing the world, one that valued the past and looked forward with patience. As he turned off the lights and locked the door, Ethan felt a deep sense of gratitude. He knew his grandfather had never rushed, never been driven by immediate gains. His grandfather had understood that true value was in the quiet moments, the ones that couldn't be measured in sales or profits, but in the stories that wove the fabric of the world. With that thought, Ethan locked the door behind him and stepped into the quiet night, ready to face the future with the same patience and reverence he now held for his shop and its legacy. In the months that followed, the shop became more than just a place to buy and sell antiques. It became a part of the fabric of the community. Neighbors stopped by just to chat. Visitors who once passed by without a second glance now found themselves lingering in the doorway. Ethan had transformed the space into something much bigger than he ever expected. A gathering place for stories, memories, and shared experiences. The once quiet shop buzzed with life and laughter, and even the air in the store felt different, lighter, more welcoming. One morning, Ethan found a letter slipped under the door. It was from Mrs. Walker, the woman who had first planted the seed of change in his mind. She had written, simply, "You did it. You slowed down, and in doing so, you found what you were looking for. It's always been about connection, Ethan. I knew you had it in you." As Ethan read the letter, a smile tugged at his lips. He had made it, not by rushing forward but by taking the time to look back, to appreciate the little moments, and to find value in the things that truly mattered. It had been several months since Ethan had last seen Mrs. Walker, but one chilly morning she appeared again at the door of the shop. This time, there was a distinct air about her, a sense of purpose that made her stand out even more than before. She greeted Ethan warmly, and they exchanged pleasantries. But this time, instead of just browsing, she seemed to have something on her mind. She approached the counter and placed an old leather-bound book in front of him. Ethan looked up in surprise, his eyes scanning the cover. It was an antique ledger, filled with delicate handwriting and ornate sketches. "This," Mrs. Walker began, "was the book your grandfather used to record the transactions of the shop in the early days. He believed that each transaction had a story, and he would write it down. I've been holding on to it all these years, but I think it's time you have it." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was more than just a book. It was a tangible link to the past, a record of the shop's true legacy. Mrs. Walker had always seemed like a mysterious figure, but now he saw her as something more, a custodian of the shop's history. He accepted the book with gratitude, feeling an overwhelming sense of connection to his grandfather and the values he had cherished. That evening, after the shop had closed, Ethan sat alone in the dim light of the store, flipping through the pages of the old ledger. The handwriting was faded but still legible. As he read, he discovered something unexpected: his grandfather's early struggles with the business, the times he had nearly given up, and his attempts to build lasting relationships with customers. There were notes about particular customers, the stories behind each item sold, and even detailed descriptions of objects that had long since disappeared from the shelves. Ethan was surprised to find that the shop had once been a place of deep meaning for the community. His grandfather had been a man who valued the emotional connection between people and objects, just as Mrs. Walker had suggested. The book painted a picture of a time when the shop wasn't about profit, but about stories, and the items were not mere commodities but precious relics of the past that carried the weight of memories. As Ethan read on, a feeling of responsibility washed over him. The shop wasn't just a business. It was a living, breathing entity with a rich history, and it was up to him to continue that legacy. The ledger was more than just a collection of transactions. It was a reminder of the deep importance of the shop's purpose. The next morning, Ethan woke up early, determined to make a change. As he walked into the shop, the familiar scent of old wood and antiques filled the air, but today it felt different. He had a renewed sense of purpose, one that was not driven by sales but by honoring the vision his grandfather had for the shop. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the true worth of the shop wasn't in its inventory or its customers. It was in the space it created, the history it preserved, and the community it nurtured. Ethan took a deep breath and smiled as he began rearranging the shelves, not to make them more appealing, but to make them more meaningful. He wanted each item to tell a story, to have a place in the grand narrative of the shop's legacy. He started to focus on the personal connections he had with the objects, bringing new life to the items with stories of their origins and significance. The shop was no longer a place of impersonal transactions. It had become a sanctuary for those who valued history, memories, and the deeper connections between people and things. One morning, just as Ethan was about to open the shop, he noticed an envelope sticking out from under the door. It was addressed to him, but there was no return address, only a cryptic message on the front, for the future of the shop. Intrigued, he opened it slowly, unfolding the letter inside. The letter was brief, but the message was clear. Ethan had been invited to a meeting with a group of people who were interested in the future of his grandfather's shop. The letter didn't provide much detail, only the time and place of the meeting, an old, forgotten part of town that Ethan had only heard of in whispers. Curiosity gnawed at him. Who were these people? Why were they interested in the shop? And what did they want with him? Ethan's mind raced as he pondered the possibilities, his unease growing with each passing minute. Despite his reservations, he knew he couldn't ignore the invitation. There was something about it that felt important, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of excitement stirring within him. That afternoon, Ethan arrived at the location specified in the letter, an old, dimly lit room above a bookstore. The room was filled with an assortment of people, all older than him, and all looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. As he stepped in, a tall woman with silver hair approached him and extended her hand. "I'm Judith," she said with a smile. "We've been waiting for you." Ethan was taken aback, but he shook her hand. "What is all of this?" he asked, looking around at the group. Judith motioned for him to take a seat. "We are the descendants of the original patrons of your grandfather's shop." He was more than just a shopkeeper. He was a keeper of stories, a preserver of memories, and we've all come together today because we believe it's time for the next chapter to begin. Ethan's eyes widened. This was more than just a meeting. It was a gathering of people who shared a deep connection to the history of his shop, people who had been part of its story long before he had ever stepped foot inside. As Judith continued to speak, Ethan realized that the shop was about to become something much larger than he had ever imagined. This was just the beginning. The room fell silent as Judith spoke again, her voice steady but full of conviction. "We want to help you preserve your grandfather's legacy. But we also believe it's time for the shop to evolve, to become something more than just a place for antiques. We want to make it a center for storytelling, for preserving the memories of those who visit. We want to create a space where history comes alive, where people can connect with their past, their families, and each other." Ethan listened, astonished by the depth of their vision. He had always viewed the shop as a business, something to be maintained and managed. But these people saw it as a living, breathing entity, something that could connect generations, bridge gaps between people, and become a hub of cultural exchange. "We believe that with your help," Judith continued, "the shop can be transformed into a place where the future meets the past. A place where stories are shared, memories are preserved, and history is celebrated. And we would like you to be a part of this. Your grandfather trusted you with this legacy, and now it's time for you to decide what comes next." Ethan felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It wasn't just about running a shop anymore. It was about continuing a legacy that was much larger than himself. The future of the shop was in his hands, and for the first time he felt truly ready to embrace it. These sections continue to explore Ethan's growth, his connection with his grandfather's legacy, and the beginning of a new chapter for the shop. After much contemplation, Ethan felt a sense of resolve settle within him. The meeting had shaken him, but it also ignited a spark of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The group's vision for the future of the shop was bold, yet it felt right. He thought of his grandfather's passion for preserving stories, the way he had never been solely concerned with profit but with the deeper meaning behind every transaction. Now, as he stood at the crossroads of his own life, Ethan realized that continuing that legacy required more than just maintaining the shop. It required a shift in how he viewed it. "I'm in," Ethan said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Let's do it. Let's transform this shop into what it was always meant to be." The group members exchanged smiles and nods of approval. There was an unspoken understanding between them all. This was a beginning, a new chapter in a story that was far from finished. As the meeting came to a close, Ethan was handed a binder filled with plans for the shop's transformation. It was time to take the first steps toward a future that blended the past with the present, creating a space where stories could live on. In the weeks that followed, the shop underwent a series of renovations that were both exciting and challenging. Ethan worked closely with the group, using the binder they'd given him as a guide. They wanted to maintain the shop's historical charm, but they also needed to make it more accessible to modern visitors. It was a delicate balance. Old wooden shelves were refinished, and the walls, which had once been bare, were now adorned with photographs of past customers, memorabilia, and handwritten stories about the items on display. However, the most important changes were not visible to the eye. They were in the way the shop began to operate. Ethan started incorporating interactive elements, encouraging customers to share their own stories about the items they purchased or the memories they had attached to them. The shelves became more than just places to store objects. They became repositories of personal histories. For the first time, the shop felt alive in a way it never had before. Ethan could see his grandfather's influence everywhere, from the careful curation of objects to the way people interacted with them. As the shop's transformation continued, word began to spread through the community. The changes weren't just physical, there was a renewed energy in the air. People started to visit the shop not only to purchase antiques but to learn about the stories behind them. The interactive displays sparked conversations, and customers were eager to share their own histories, adding new layers to the shop's growing collection of memories. What had once been a quiet place was now bustling with life, with customers and visitors alike coming together to connect with the past. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Local newspapers ran features about the shop's revival, highlighting the unique approach Ethan had taken. People appreciated the blend of old and new, the way the shop honored its history while embracing the future. Ethan found himself growing more and more connected to the community, realizing that the shop had become more than just a business. It was a gathering place, a space where people came to reflect, share, and learn from one another. One rainy afternoon, just as Ethan was finishing up the day's work, Mrs. Walker appeared once again at the shop. She had always been a somewhat enigmatic figure, but now there was a new sense of urgency about her. Ethan noticed the familiar old leather-bound book in her hands, but this time, it wasn't just a sentimental gesture. "Ethan," she said, her voice more serious than before, "I've been thinking a lot about the changes at the shop, and I believe it's time for you to take the next step." Ethan was intrigued. "What do you mean?" he asked, setting down the object he was holding and giving her his full attention. Mrs. Walker leaned in, her eyes gleaming with something akin to excitement. "The shop is ready for something greater than just a transformation. It's time to take your grandfather's legacy and expand it beyond the walls of this shop." Ethan blinked in surprise. He had been so focused on the changes inside the shop that he hadn't even considered the possibility of expansion. Mrs. Walker smiled, sensing his confusion. "I've been in touch with a group of investors who are fascinated by your grandfather's legacy and the direction you're taking. They want to help you expand the shop's concept, not just locally, but globally. They believe the world is ready for this kind of space." The idea of expanding the shop was daunting, but it also sparked a sense of excitement in Ethan that he couldn't ignore. Over the past few months, the shop had transformed into something he never could have imagined. It was no longer just a place to buy antiques. It had become a sanctuary for stories, a space where people could reflect on their pasts and connect with one another. But the thought of turning it into a global concept was a whole different challenge. Could he replicate this unique atmosphere on a larger scale? Would it lose its intimate charm? As he sat in the quiet of the shop that evening, the rain tapping against the windows, Ethan weighed the possibilities. The idea of honoring his grandfather's legacy on a global stage felt like an enormous responsibility, but it was also an opportunity to bring something truly special to the world. After much deliberation, Ethan made his decision. "I'm going to do it," he whispered to himself. "I'm going to expand." The next day, he called Mrs. Walker to let her know that he was ready to move forward. It was time to share the magic of the shop with the world. With Mrs. Walker's help, Ethan began researching potential locations for the shop's expansion. They worked together to develop a plan that would allow them to replicate the shop's unique blend of history and modernity in different cities. The process was complex, involving everything from scouting potential storefronts to negotiating with investors, but Mrs. Walker's expertise and guidance helped Ethan navigate the challenges. She had years of experience in business and cultural preservation, and her support was invaluable. As the expansion project began to take shape, Ethan couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. The shop that had started as a modest family business was about to become a global enterprise. But he wasn't just opening new locations, he was creating spaces where people could connect with the past, learn about the significance of objects, and share their own stories. It wasn't just about selling antiques, it was about building a community, one story at a time. Ethan was determined to stay true to his grandfather's vision, no matter how far the shop might reach. These sections continue the story's progression, focusing on Ethan's decision to expand the shop's legacy and the support he receives along the way. The opening of the first new shop location in a major city was a monumental moment. Ethan, Mrs. Walker, and their team had carefully curated every detail, from the layout to the stories shared in each section. The new location was a blend of modern design and vintage charm, just like the original shop, but with a slightly more contemporary touch to appeal to a broader audience. As the doors opened on the first day, Ethan held his breath, watching as people from all walks of life entered the space. What he didn't expect was the level of enthusiasm from both locals and tourists alike. Visitors were drawn in by the concept of not only buying antiques but also connecting with the personal histories behind the items. Tourists marveled at the opportunity to learn about the rich stories tied to the objects, while locals appreciated the shop's role in preserving the heritage of the area. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with many commenting that the shop provided a unique experience that could not be found anywhere else. Ethan felt an immense sense of pride as he saw the community begin to embrace the shop's new identity. As the first new location flourished, momentum for the shop's global expansion grew. Interest from other cities was overwhelming. Investors and cultural preservation groups alike saw the potential in Ethan's vision, and soon, additional locations were opening in major metropolitan areas around the world. Each shop stayed true to the core values of the original, preserving history, celebrating stories, and fostering connections, but also adapted to the local cultures, showcasing artifacts and stories that resonated with each community. With every new opening, Ethan realized that he wasn't just growing a business, he was building a movement. People were beginning to understand that the shop wasn't just a place to buy things. It was a place to understand the significance of what we keep and the stories behind it. The shops became centers of learning and sharing, allowing people from all walks of life to connect with the past while engaging with the present. Ethan's vision was taking shape beyond his wildest dreams, and the world was starting to take notice. As the number of locations continued to grow, the press took notice. Major publications and media outlets started to write about Ethan's transformation of the family business. The story of a small, unassuming shop turned global sensation intrigued journalists and readers alike. Soon, the shop was being referred to as a global treasure trove, a place where history came to life and personal stories were shared across borders. The press painted Ethan as a visionary, someone who had successfully merged the old with the new, creating a unique space that celebrated culture and memories. Ethan was both humbled and overwhelmed by the media attention. At first, he had simply hoped to honor his grandfather's legacy, but now it seemed like he was on the brink of creating something much bigger. The shop's expansion wasn't just about financial success, it was about offering people a chance to connect with the world in a deeper way. As the press continued to highlight his success, Ethan began to realize just how much of an impact his vision had made, reaching people far beyond his initial expectations. One afternoon, Mrs. Walker called Ethan with exciting news. "I've arranged a meeting with some philanthropists who are deeply interested in what you're doing," she said. "They want to help you take this vision even further." Ethan was intrigued. He had always focused on the business side of things, but he knew the importance of having the right people in his corner to push the shop's mission even further. The following week, Ethan met with a group of influential philanthropists who had a history of supporting cultural preservation and educational initiatives. They were captivated by the shop's concept and its potential to inspire future generations. "We want to help you create educational programs that bring people closer to history, storytelling, and cultural preservation," one philanthropist said. "This project has the power to make a global impact, not just as a business but as a movement." Ethan was thrilled by the idea. With their financial backing, he could create programs that brought history to life in schools, museums, and community centers around the world. The philanthropist's support marked the beginning of a new chapter in the shop's journey, one that was about more than just artifacts, but about creating meaningful connections across cultures and generations. With the philanthropist's backing, Ethan moved forward with launching the educational program he had always envisioned. The goal was simple: to take the stories of the past and bring them into the present, educating people of all ages on the importance of preserving culture and history. The program would not only teach the significance of the objects in the shop but also encourage people to share their own stories, creating a global dialogue about memory, identity, and heritage. Ethan worked with historians, educators, and storytellers to develop a curriculum that would be both informative and engaging. The program was designed to be adaptable to different age groups, from schoolchildren to adults, and it was offered through a combination of online courses, in-store workshops, and traveling exhibitions. The first workshops were a resounding success, with participants sharing their own personal histories and learning about the objects that had shaped their lives. As the program gained traction, Ethan realized that this was his true calling: not just to sell antiques but to be a catalyst for storytelling and cultural preservation on a global scale. As the educational program gained popularity, it didn't take long for schools and cultural institutions worldwide to take notice. Teachers and administrators saw the potential in using the shop's curriculum as a way to connect students with the past in a tangible and meaningful way. Soon, partnerships were formed with schools across the globe, and the program was incorporated into educational systems. Cultural institutions such as museums and libraries also joined the initiative, using the shop's resources to enhance their own educational offerings. Exhibits were created where people could learn about the history behind objects and stories from different cultures, and workshops were held to encourage the public to reflect on their own personal histories. Ethan couldn't believe how far his vision had come. What had started as a small shop had blossomed into an educational movement, connecting people of all ages to the rich history of the world. The growing media attention, combined with the success of the educational programs, led to an unexpected opportunity. A well-known publisher reached out to Ethan with an offer to write a book about his journey, from the humble beginnings of the shop to its global expansion and the cultural movement it had sparked. Ethan was initially hesitant, unsure of whether he wanted to put his story into print. But after much thought, he realized that the book could help share the message of his mission with even more people. The book, titled A Legacy of Stories, chronicled the transformation of the shop, the challenges Ethan faced, and the people who helped him along the way. It also delved deeply into the importance of preserving stories and cultures for future generations. The book became a bestseller, further solidifying the shop's place in history as not only a business but a cultural force that changed the way people viewed history and storytelling. As time passed, Ethan's shop became more than just a business. It became a symbol of cultural preservation. The movement that started with a single store in a small town had expanded to major cities worldwide, leaving an indelible mark on society. Ethan was invited to speak at international conferences and cultural events, where he shared his journey and vision. His story became one of perseverance, innovation, and the power of storytelling to unite people from all walks of life. His legacy wasn't just about the physical locations of the shop or the educational programs he created, it was about the cultural shift he had sparked. People around the world began to appreciate the value of preserving stories and traditions, and many others started similar initiatives, inspired by the work Ethan had done. As he looked back on the journey, Ethan realized that what began as a simple act of honoring his grandfather had transformed into a global movement. His legacy was secure, not just in the success of the shop, but in the lives it had touched and the cultures it had helped preserve. As Ethan's global empire grew, Mrs. Walker remained a steady presence, guiding him through the complexities of running such a large-scale operation. But as time passed, she realized that her work wasn't finished yet. In her final act of mentorship, Mrs. Walker worked tirelessly behind the scenes to secure funding for a groundbreaking global preservation project. The idea was to create a network of cultural centers around the world, each focused on preserving local traditions, stories, and artifacts. These centers would also serve as hubs for education, research, and cultural exchange. Ethan knew this project would be the crowning achievement of their work. With Mrs. Walker's connections and the philanthropic support they had received, the project quickly gained momentum. Cultural leaders, scholars, and communities from all over the world contributed to the effort, offering artifacts, stories, and expertise. The project was officially launched, and within a few years, cultural centers began to open in cities and towns globally. Each center became a beacon of local heritage and a place where future generations could learn about the rich diversity of the world's cultures. As the Global Preservation Project took shape, it began to garner attention from major international organizations. UNESCO, known for its efforts to preserve world heritage, recognized the initiative as a groundbreaking step towards safeguarding cultural history. Other prominent cultural and educational organizations followed suit, offering support and collaboration. The recognition was both humbling and rewarding for Ethan, who had never anticipated that the simple act of preserving his grandfather's antiques would evolve into such a monumental global movement. The collaboration with these organizations not only provided financial and logistical support but also validated the importance of cultural preservation on a global scale. Conferences were held, and exhibitions showcased the work done by the cultural centers, bringing attention to the significance of preserving intangible heritage such as folklore, traditions, and languages. Ethan was invited to speak at prestigious events, where he shared how the project was making a tangible difference in communities around the world. With the world's most respected institutions backing the project, Ethan knew they were on the right path toward ensuring that future generations would have access to the stories and artifacts that made the world rich in history and culture. In a new effort to give back to the global community, Ethan decided to use the shop's influence and network to support charitable causes. Through exclusive charity auctions, rare and valuable items from the shop's collection were offered to bidders, with all proceeds going towards supporting cultural preservation projects, education, and humanitarian efforts. These auctions quickly became highly anticipated events, attracting collectors, philanthropists, and anyone passionate about supporting a good cause. Ethan saw this as an opportunity to combine his love for history with a deeper sense of purpose. The items being auctioned ranged from historical artifacts to one-of-a-kind collectibles, all with fascinating stories attached. Each auction told a different story, bringing attention to various cultures and the importance of preserving their legacies. Not only did the auctions raise significant funds for worthy causes, but they also allowed people to connect with history in a personal way, owning a piece of the past while contributing to its future. The charity auctions became a staple of the shop's operations, further cementing the store's reputation as a force for good in the world. Ethan's hard work and dedication didn't go unnoticed. In recognition of his tireless efforts to preserve history and culture, he was honored with a prestigious award for his contributions to cultural preservation. The awards ceremony took place at a grand event attended by global leaders, educators, and philanthropists. When Ethan took the stage to accept the award, he was met with a standing ovation. He had built something incredible, a legacy that would outlast him and continue to inspire future generations. As Ethan looked out at the sea of faces, he thought about how far he had come. The shop, once a small family-owned business, had blossomed into a global movement, touching the lives of countless people. The education programs, the Global Preservation Project, the charity auctions, all of these efforts had created a lasting impact on the world. The award was the culmination of years of hard work and vision, but Ethan knew it was just the beginning. There was still so much more to do, and he was more determined than ever to continue the mission of preserving culture, history, and stories for the generations to come. With each passing year, the shop's influence continued to grow, inspiring new generations of cultural leaders and historians. Young people around the world looked up to Ethan and his work, seeing him as a model of how one person could make a difference in preserving the world's heritage. Many students, teachers, and artists sought out internships, apprenticeships, and opportunities to collaborate with the shop. Ethan's journey was now part of the curriculum at schools and universities, where students studied his approach to cultural preservation, storytelling, and global outreach. Ethan felt a deep sense of pride as he watched the next generation of cultural leaders take their place in the world. Many of them had been influenced by the shop's programs or had visited one of the cultural centers around the globe. They had learned the importance of history, culture, and the power of storytelling, and they were eager to carry on the work that Ethan had started. He knew that as long as people continued to tell stories, preserve traditions, and value heritage, the work he had begun would live on long after he was gone. As Ethan looked toward the future, he knew that the success of his global preservation movement depended on ensuring that future generations of cultural preservationists were well equipped to continue the work. In honor of Mrs. Walker and all the mentors who had helped him, he established a scholarship fund for students pursuing degrees in history, anthropology, and cultural preservation. This fund was designed to provide financial assistance to those with a deep passion for safeguarding cultural heritage but lacking the resources to pursue their studies. The scholarship quickly became one of the most sought-after awards in academia, attracting top students from around the world. These scholars would go on to work in the very cultural centers and institutions that Ethan had helped establish. For Ethan, seeing these young, talented individuals take on important roles within the preservation movement was incredibly rewarding. The scholarship fund became an essential part of his legacy, ensuring that cultural preservation would remain a focus for future generations. The students, many of whom had been inspired by Ethan's work, would help carry on his mission of preserving cultural stories for years to come. The original shop, where it all began, eventually became a historical landmark. The building that once housed Ethan's small antique store was transformed into a museum dedicated to preserving the history of the shop and its founder. The museum displayed not only the treasures collected over the years but also artifacts from the shop's early days, chronicling how a simple act of preserving antiques had evolved into a global cultural preservation movement. Visitors from around the world traveled to see the place where Ethan had started, learning about the incredible journey of the shop and its transformation from a small local business into an internationally recognized symbol of cultural preservation. The museum was not just a place to look at artifacts, it was an interactive experience where visitors could engage with history, listen to stories, and participate in workshops about preservation techniques. The original shop's legacy was preserved in the very walls of the museum, where every corner told a part of the story. The museum also served as a hub for events, lectures, and exhibitions on cultural preservation, providing a space for experts and enthusiasts alike to come together and discuss new ways of protecting heritage. For Ethan, seeing the shop's original location become a place of learning and reflection was a fitting tribute to all the hard work that had gone into building the preservation movement. As Ethan's health began to decline with age, he realized it was time to pass on the leadership of the shop to someone who could carry on his vision. After much consideration, he decided to involve his family in the shop's leadership. His children, who had grown up surrounded by the store's history and its mission, were eager to take on more responsibility. With their combined skills in business, management, and cultural studies, they were the perfect candidates to ensure the continued success of the shop and the preservation movement. Ethan's son took on the role of CEO, overseeing the global operations, while his daughter became the head of the cultural preservation program. Together, they formed a strong leadership team, with Ethan still serving as an advisor. Under their guidance, the shop expanded even further, developing new initiatives to connect with younger audiences and involve them in the importance of cultural preservation. Ethan knew that the future of his work was in good hands, and he felt a sense of peace knowing that his family would continue to grow the movement for generations to come. In an effort to bring people together and foster understanding between cultures, Ethan and his family launched a series of cultural exchange programs. These programs allowed people from different parts of the world to visit cultural centers, share their own traditions, and learn from others. Participants had the opportunity to engage in workshops, participate in community events, and collaborate with local experts on preservation projects. The programs quickly became popular, offering participants a unique opportunity to immerse themselves in different cultures and deepen their understanding of global history. The exchange programs also helped to raise awareness about the importance of preserving intangible cultural heritage, such as language, music, and customs, which were often at risk of disappearing. By connecting people from diverse backgrounds, the programs facilitated conversations about the shared value of cultural preservation and the need to safeguard traditions for future generations. These exchanges not only enriched the lives of those who participated but also strengthened the global preservation movement, reinforcing Ethan's belief that cultural understanding was essential to building a more connected world. As the network of cultural preservation centers grew, they began hosting international events and conferences that brought together experts, scholars, artists, and activists from all over the world. These events focused on the most pressing issues facing cultural preservation today, from the effects of globalization on indigenous languages to the impact of climate change on historic sites. Through these conferences, the centers became key players in the global dialogue about cultural preservation, providing a platform for new ideas, collaborations, and innovations in the field. Ethan, though retired from the day-to-day operations of the shop, continued to attend these events, offering his insights and learning from the newest developments in preservation. The conferences also allowed for the exchange of knowledge between different cultures, fostering mutual respect and understanding. As the events grew in stature, they became must-attend gatherings for anyone passionate about preserving the world's cultural heritage. The cultural centers not only served as physical locations for preserving artifacts but also as hubs for global conversations on how to safeguard intangible heritage in an ever-changing world. One of the most significant initiatives that Ethan and his team launched was a global movement aimed at protecting endangered languages. Recognizing that language is one of the most important aspects of cultural identity, the shop partnered with linguists, cultural organizations, and governments to raise awareness about the rapid decline of many languages worldwide. They organized campaigns, educational programs, and fundraising efforts to help document, teach, and revitalize endangered languages, particularly those spoken by indigenous communities. The movement gained widespread support, with schools, universities, and cultural centers around the world adopting programs to teach endangered languages and preserve them for future generations. The shop's involvement in this movement became a defining moment in its history, as it addressed a critical issue in cultural preservation. Ethan's passion for language and storytelling was evident in this initiative, and it became one of the most impactful aspects of the preservation project. As the movement grew, Ethan felt immense pride knowing that his work had helped to protect not just physical artifacts but also the words and stories that defined entire cultures. Recognizing the growing role of technology in preserving cultural heritage, Ethan and his team partnered with cutting-edge technology companies to digitize cultural artifacts. These partnerships aimed to create digital archives that would allow anyone, anywhere in the world, to explore and study important cultural items without the risks associated with physical handling. Through advanced scanning techniques and 3D modeling, the team was able to create high-resolution digital replicas of fragile items such as manuscripts, paintings, and textiles. These digital versions could be accessed by researchers, educators, and the general public, ensuring that cultural treasures were preserved for future generations. The collaboration with tech companies not only enhanced the shop's preservation efforts but also set a precedent for the integration of digital technology into cultural heritage conservation. By digitizing artifacts, the shop was able to create virtual museums and online galleries, making cultural heritage more accessible than ever before. This move into the digital realm was particularly important for communities with limited access to physical museums and cultural centers. It helped bridge the gap between tradition and modernity, preserving the richness of cultural history while adapting to the digital age. Ethan marveled at how technology was transforming the way people could experience and engage with the world's cultural treasures. In a bid to further support the global preservation movement, the shop launched a line of ethically sourced products that directly benefited cultural artisans and craftsmen. These products, ranging from handmade jewelry to woven textiles, were created by artisans from indigenous communities around the world. The idea was to provide a marketplace for these artisans, helping them to sustain their traditional crafts while also ensuring that their work was respected and valued. A portion of the proceeds from each sale went back into the community to fund educational initiatives, preservation programs, and resources for the artisans. The shop's new line of products quickly gained popularity among consumers who were eager to support ethical practices and contribute to the preservation of traditional arts. Through this initiative, the shop not only helped sustain ancient craftsmanship but also educated customers about the importance of ethical consumerism. For Ethan and his family, this new venture was a natural extension of their mission, to protect and promote cultural heritage. It was a way to give back to the artisans who kept traditions alive and to ensure that those traditions would be passed on for generations to come. As the cultural preservation movement continued to grow, it began attracting the attention of governments, international organizations, and influential cultural institutions. What had started as a small shop initiative had transformed into a global cause that was now recognized by leaders across the world. Governments saw the movement as an important tool for strengthening cultural identity and fostering national pride, while international organizations such as UNESCO praised the shop's efforts to raise awareness about the need for cultural heritage protection. These newfound partnerships provided the movement with additional resources and support, allowing it to expand even further. Governments began to fund preservation projects, with the shop's initiatives serving as models for other regions to follow. Ethan and his family worked closely with policymakers, cultural diplomats, and organizations to influence the development of global preservation standards and practices. The recognition from governments and international organizations was a turning point in the movement's history, legitimizing its efforts and solidifying Ethan's role as a key figure in the global preservation landscape. It was proof that their work was making a real difference in the world. Building on the momentum of the movement, Ethan and his family helped establish a global network of cultural preservationists. This network connected individuals, organizations, and communities working to protect cultural heritage, providing them with a platform to share ideas, resources, and best practices. The network became a central hub for collaboration, where experts could exchange knowledge about conservation techniques, historical research, and community-based preservation efforts. It also served as a forum for advocating for the protection of cultural heritage laws and policies, ensuring that governments and institutions prioritized cultural preservation. The creation of this global network marked a major milestone in Ethan's mission. What had started as a solitary effort in his small shop had now grown into a worldwide movement with a unified voice. The network facilitated numerous partnerships and joint projects, such as conservation expeditions and educational outreach programs. Ethan's role as the network's founder and leader was a proud moment for him, knowing that he had built a lasting legacy that would continue to impact the world's cultural landscape. The network became a vital resource for preservationists everywhere, helping to unite people across cultures in the shared goal of safeguarding humanity's heritage. Over the years, the shop's work and the cultural preservation movement it had sparked began to influence global cultural policy. Policymakers and cultural experts from around the world looked to the shop's model as a source of inspiration, adopting many of its practices in their own countries. From the creation of national cultural preservation programs to the development of international conventions on the protection of cultural heritage, the shop's influence was felt far beyond its original location. Ethan and his family were invited to speak at international forums and conferences, where they shared their experiences and insights on the importance of preserving cultural heritage. The shop's success was seen as a proof of concept that cultural preservation could be both a grassroots and a global endeavor. Ethan's message was clear: protecting cultural heritage was not just the responsibility of museums and institutions but of everyone. As more countries adopted policies and strategies for preserving their heritage, the world's cultural diversity became better protected, thanks in part to the tireless work of the shop and its movement. In an effort to further solidify the future of cultural preservation, the shop formed partnerships with major universities around the world to establish dedicated programs in cultural preservation and heritage studies. These academic programs provided students with the knowledge and skills necessary to pursue careers in preserving cultural artifacts, traditions, and intangible heritage. The shop collaborated with university departments to design curricula that blended theory with practical experience, allowing students to work on live preservation projects and gain hands-on knowledge. The establishment of these programs helped to cultivate a new generation of cultural preservationists, ensuring that the movement would continue long after Ethan and his family had stepped back from their leadership roles. The universities also offered research opportunities, and many students became involved in documenting and preserving endangered cultural practices and artifacts. The partnership with universities also led to the development of internships and fellowships, providing students with valuable real-world experience in the field. For Ethan, seeing universities embrace the cause of cultural preservation and develop new educational pathways was one of the greatest achievements of the movement. To recognize the outstanding contributions made by individuals, organizations, and communities to the field of cultural preservation, the shop introduced the Global Cultural Heritage Awards. This prestigious event was held annually and celebrated those who had made significant strides in safeguarding cultural heritage. The awards highlighted the tireless work of preservationists, archaeologists, historians, and community leaders who had dedicated their lives to protecting cultural treasures. The awards quickly became a highlight of the global cultural preservation calendar, with winners gaining international recognition for their work. The shop's sponsorship of the event showcased its commitment to honoring the people who were making a tangible difference in the world. It also provided a platform for others to learn from the achievements of those being recognized, inspiring further action and innovation in the field of cultural preservation. For Ethan and his family, it was an opportunity to reflect on the impact they had made while also acknowledging the wider global effort to protect heritage. As the movement grew, so did the need for a larger presence. The shop, once just a small operation, opened a second location in a major cultural city, Paris. The decision to expand to a city known for its rich history and artistic heritage was a strategic one, allowing the shop to reach a broader audience and build partnerships with global cultural institutions. This new location became a cultural hub in its own right, hosting exhibitions, educational programs, and events focused on cultural preservation. The Paris location also served as a base for international collaboration, with scholars, artists, and preservationists from around the world coming together to discuss and advance the field. The expansion into Paris was a pivotal moment for the movement, signaling its global reach and the growing recognition of the importance of preserving cultural heritage. The shop's presence in such a renowned city cemented its position as a key player in the cultural preservation landscape. Ethan's vision was now realized on a global scale, with the shop's influence reaching far beyond its original walls. To further expand its reach and impact, the shop launched a digital platform designed to facilitate global collaboration among cultural preservationists, researchers, and educators. This platform allowed individuals and organizations to share resources, discuss challenges, and collaborate on preservation projects from anywhere in the world. It featured virtual conferences, webinars, and forums where people could learn from one another, exchange ideas, and work together on safeguarding cultural heritage. The digital platform became a cornerstone of the shop's global network, providing a centralized space for people to connect and collaborate on preservation efforts. It also offered online courses, toolkits, and guidelines for anyone interested in getting involved in cultural preservation, from professionals to amateurs. The platform's success highlighted the importance of using technology to connect people and facilitate the sharing of knowledge, particularly in the face of global challenges like climate change and the loss of cultural traditions. For Ethan, seeing his movement go digital was a natural evolution, expanding its reach and influence to an even wider audience. As the movement continued to expand, its success caught the attention of filmmakers who wanted to tell the story of Ethan's journey and the global cultural preservation movement. A major documentary film was produced, showcasing the shop's origins, its transformation, and the impact it had on the world. The film followed Ethan's journey from the humble shopkeeper to a global leader in cultural preservation, highlighting the challenges he faced, the partnerships he formed, and the remarkable achievements of his movement. The documentary brought Ethan's story and the cause of cultural preservation to an even larger audience, reaching millions of viewers around the world. It also featured interviews with key figures in the preservation field, showcasing the diverse individuals and organizations that had joined the movement. The film's release was a milestone for the shop, providing global recognition and further solidifying its position as a leader in the field. For Ethan, seeing his story shared with the world was a deeply humbling experience, and he was proud to know that his efforts had inspired so many people to take action in preserving cultural heritage. In recognition of Ethan's lifelong dedication to cultural preservation, a Global Cultural Preservation Foundation was established in his honor. This foundation was designed to support the continued work of preservationists around the world, providing grants, resources, and educational opportunities to those working in the field. The foundation's mission was to ensure that cultural heritage was protected for future generations and that the work of cultural preservationists continued to be supported at the highest levels. Ethan's family played a key role in the foundation, overseeing its operations and ensuring that it remained true to his vision. The foundation quickly gained support from governments, corporations, and philanthropists who wanted to contribute to the cause of cultural preservation. For Ethan, knowing that his legacy would live on through the foundation was a profound moment. It marked the culmination of a lifetime of work, and he could rest assured that the movement he had started would continue to thrive long after he was gone. To bring cultural preservation to an even wider audience, the shop formed partnerships with major museums around the world, facilitating the creation of traveling exhibits that showcased preserved cultural artifacts and traditions. These exhibits allowed people from different countries to experience the richness of cultures they might not have otherwise encountered. Each exhibit was carefully curated, ensuring that the historical context and significance of the artifacts were highlighted while maintaining the utmost respect for the cultures they represented. The traveling exhibits not only promoted cultural awareness but also highlighted the importance of preserving heritage for future generations. The shop's involvement in these exhibits reinforced its role as a leader in the cultural preservation movement, drawing attention from the media and international cultural organizations. Through this collaboration, Ethan and his family were able to reach new audiences and engage with people from diverse backgrounds, encouraging them to take part in the global effort to safeguard cultural traditions and artifacts. The success of the traveling exhibits demonstrated the power of cultural exchange and the universal desire to connect with our shared human history. Recognizing the need for early education in cultural preservation, the shop expanded its educational programs to schools and communities around the world. Through workshops, online courses, and educational kits, children and young adults were taught the importance of cultural heritage and the need to protect it. The programs covered everything from the history of different cultures to the practical aspects of preserving artifacts, making the learning experience both engaging and informative. The shop's educational initiatives proved to be immensely successful, reaching thousands of students in various countries. These programs not only sparked interest in cultural preservation but also empowered young people to become active participants in the movement. By teaching the next generation about the value of cultural heritage, the shop ensured that its work would have a lasting impact on the future. Ethan and his team were proud to see young people passionate about preserving their own cultural identities, and the shop's educational expansion was another key step in cementing the Global Preservation Movement's foundation. As part of its commitment to preserving cultural heritage on a global scale, the shop launched a groundbreaking crowdfunding campaign to support the preservation of endangered heritage sites around the world. The campaign focused on raising funds for urgent restoration projects in areas where cultural landmarks were at risk due to climate change, neglect, or conflict. The campaign utilized social media platforms, engaging millions of people from diverse backgrounds who wanted to contribute to the protection of these priceless cultural treasures. The crowdfunding campaign was an overwhelming success, attracting donations from individuals, foundations, and even governments. The funds raised helped to repair and preserve ancient monuments, temples, and other heritage sites that were at risk of being lost forever. Ethan and his family were moved by the global outpouring of support, and they worked closely with local communities and preservation experts to ensure that the funds were used effectively. The campaign demonstrated the power of collective action in preserving cultural heritage and reinforced the idea that the protection of these sites was a shared responsibility for all of humanity. As the years passed, Ethan's vision for global cultural preservation was fully realized. The movement he had started with a small shop had grown into a worldwide network of individuals, organizations, and governments all working together to protect the world's cultural heritage. Through partnerships, educational programs, crowdfunding campaigns, and traveling exhibits, the movement had successfully raised awareness and provided tangible support for preservation efforts around the globe. Ethan looked back on everything that had been accomplished with a sense of pride and fulfillment. His legacy was not just in the shop itself but in the lasting impact the movement had on the world. His work had inspired countless others to take action and to recognize the importance of preserving our cultural history. As the movement continued to thrive, Ethan knew that the protection of cultural heritage would remain a priority for future generations. He had started with a simple belief that culture is a vital part of our shared humanity, and had sparked a global effort to ensure that it would be safeguarded for generations to come.